All right, well, while that's rebooting, I'll at least introduce myself. My name is Dan Mallinson. I just recently graduated from Villanova from the political science master's program. And right now I work with the federal government and Department of Health and Human Services. But I'm going to talk today about an issue that's interesting to me. I attended a program in Germany last summer about the message of 1989. It's going to work. Fantastic. So this is kind of trying to carry on that message and bring it back. The goal was to bring it back to our host countries. We had students there from the US and different European countries. So the primary message, why is my background not coming up? Come on. Does anybody know how these systems are supposed to work? Great. Oh, it's almost there. Oh. No, that might be it. Dashboard. Well, while we're getting started, because I can give it without the presentation if I need to. It's a little better with the pictures. But we're going to start with a little activity to get everybody thinking. The topic of discussion today is going to be about walls, about both physical walls that have been there in history, that have been put up to separate people, and also walls that we build ourselves in our daily life to separate ourselves from things that we perceive as dangerous or as unknown. So what I'd like you guys to do is just take a minute. Everybody has a little pen and paper. Just take a couple of minutes just to jot down what you think of when you think of walls. It could be very abstract, like the purpose of a wall or how walls make you feel or whatever, or it could be very literal, walls from history or walls you've experienced in your life. But just, you know, what comes to your mind when you think of walls? And then we're going to share in a moment. These displays. Oh, we're getting there. Nope. I see what's going on. Okay. Let's try this. Let's get rid of that. And Wonderful. All right. We are up and running. All right, so what did you guys come up with? Just share. We're a small group here. Everybody can just throw out what they think of or what they first think of when they think of walls. Anybody want to volunteer to be first? Sure.
To protect.
Okay, protect, good.
To make people feel safe.
Okay. Yes?
Danger on the other side.
Okay, good. Anybody else?
Two separate.
Pardon me?
Two separate. Separate.
To separate?
Yeah.
Good. Good. That's often what comes to my mind when I think of walls. Usually there's a good side and a bad side to a wall, right? You're usually protecting yourself from something. This is what I think of when I think of walls. I just threw this together. The first thing I, of course, think of is my favorite band, and one of my favorite albums of my favorite band is Pink Floyd's The Wall. That certainly comes to mind. And for anybody who hasn't listened to it, other than just being a great album, it really fits with what we're talking about today. But that's another topic. I'm also a runner, so I think of hitting the wall. When you're going at a hard pace and you still have a couple miles to go and you start running out of energy, you hit that wall and you just want to stop, but you have to find a way to break through and keep going. I also think of, this reminds me of, and I won't ask if this ever happened to anybody in elementary school, but when you get in trouble in elementary school, right, what is the punishment at recess? Yeah, you have to stand up against the wall and you have to watch everybody else have fun. And that's your punishment. That's a pretty big punishment when you're 7 and 8 years old. So I certainly think of the recess wall. I think of the Great Wall. I had the opportunity to go see that when I was in college, and that's a very goofy picture of me showing off the obvious wall in the background. But like I said, what really comes to mind first is walls of protection, and whether they be walls that are meant to keep dangerous people in. This is the Eastern State Penitentiary downtown, which isn't a functioning prison anymore, but it used to be. Or they're walls built to keep dangerous people out, such as a fort, Fort McHenry in Baltimore. But that's usually what I think of. So that's the purpose of what we're talking about today. Throughout history, humans have built walls for various reasons. Usually physical and even sort of metaphorical walls are built to try to protect us from something, as you guys pointed out. They're used to separate us from something we perceive as evil or dangerous, like with the fort or the prison. But the image that a wall provides is different depending on what side you're looking at. I like to say that there are two sides to every wall. Generally, those who build the wall see it as, again, good, protecting them from something dangerous. But when walls are used to divide people, as some of the walls that we're going to talk about today, the Berlin Wall, Israel-Palestine, the Mexico-U.S. Wall, the wall is often viewed as good on one side and generally as evil or as blocking freedom on the other side. These walls, when they're used as a policy option, they usually alleviate some short-term sort of problem, like we talked about safety, security, but often in the long run they don't solve the underlying problems of whatever's going on in that society, and they tend to create a permanent division in that society that's much more difficult to overcome. So when considering a wall as an act of policy, it's important to consider the negative connotations and the consequences of building that wall, of surrounding ourselves with walls. So through the rest of the session, we're going to look at some historical walls and some current uses of walls in the world and what they have meant to the people who they separate. And the goal is just to think more deeply about the ways we divide ourselves in society and to think a little bit before we jump to using a wall as a policy response to some particular problem. So we're going to talk about 4 different walls today, 4 different sort of types of walls. The first is the one that really will be a thread throughout the whole discussion, and that's the Berlin Wall. It's more of a political, ideological wall. It was built because during the Cold War, built between 2 competing economic systems, really between a country using capitalism, country using communism. We're going to talk about an ethnic or religious wall, which is also a physical wall as well, but really between Israel and Palestine, and also Egypt is a part of that wall. And we're going to talk about a wall as a policy response, which we have right here in the United States, and that's the U.S. The wall on the U.S.-Mexico border that's currently being constructed. And finally, I get sort of in the spirit of the day really does center around Dr. King, is we're going to talk about not a physical wall, more of a metaphorical wall, or a wall that we create between ourselves and other people in society, but one that is still legitimized through legal action. So we're going to finish by talking about that. But first we'll jump right into the Berlin Wall. So just to take a step back in history, so you have 1945, it's the end of World War II. The Allies are victorious. Germany has capitulated. There are really three conquering allies, and then France. There's the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union. And then France, who was occupied by Germany during the war, also gets a little piece of what's going on. So we have this map. I was happy to find this. These are the zones that Germany was broken up into after the war. You have the British zone, the smaller French zone, the American zone, and the Soviet zone. And then within Berlin itself, Berlin, being the capital of Germany, was also divided into four sectors, each controlled by, one of the allies. And you can see that Berlin itself is like this little island in the midst of the Soviet zone. The country of West Germany, which the three Western Allied pieces came together, or were put together and became West Germany in 1949, and also East Germany became its own separate entity in 1949, but certainly the East still had a lot of control from the Soviet Union, a lot of day-to-day decisions, and certainly any decisions that had to deal with Berlin or the borders with West Germany had to go through Moscow, and that becomes important in terms of the Berlin Wall. So the Berlin Wall went up in 1961, and it went up overnight. It was very much a surprise. Walter Ulbricht, the head of the party, the head of the Communist Party in East Germany, had said just that summer that they are not intending on building a wall in Berlin. And the reason for the wall, though, was a lot of East Germans at the time were voting with their feet. Many were leaving. They estimate that between 1949 and 1961, about 3.5 million East Germans left East Germany, which is quite a few considering the country only started at about a little less than 20 million, might be 18 or 19 million people. So that's quite a few leaving the East for the West permanently. And the people that were leaving were, a lot of them were educated. They were doctors and engineers and important people to make society function. So the East Germans had a problem on their hands of all these people fleeing. So Walter Ulbricht decided that the best way to handle this was to build a wall in Berlin, because the way that a lot of people were getting out was, as long as they could get to West Berlin, then they could fly out to West Germany. They didn't have to get across the German border. They just had to get to West Berlin. So close off West Berlin, close off East Berlin, and we'll stop the flight problem. So the wall goes up. At first, it's not really much of a wall. It's pretty much barbed wire and troops guarding the border. What it really means is there were a lot less points where allies, or where people could cross into East Germany. People of the occupational powers, the Allied powers, they were still technically allowed to freely travel from east to west, but the citizens of East Germany could no longer freely travel to the west, and those in the west, it was much more difficult to travel east. So both East and West Berliners woke up on it was very purposefully done on a Saturday night to a Sunday morning. So they woke up on a lazy Sunday, and suddenly the city was divided. But even with a tight border wall, people still managed to escape, especially initially as they saw that the borders were being closed and it was going to be much more difficult to escape. There were still many escape attempts made. This is a famous picture of an East German border guard named Konrad Schumann, he was actually standing duty on the border, and there was a group of West Berliners on the other side, and they were taunting and trying to incite him to come over. They were saying, come on, we know you want to come over, you know you want to come over," and he kind of stood there and looked like he didn't know what he wanted to do, and then he bolted. And luckily, there was a photographer there who was watching this for 15, 20 minutes, watching this process. And he got this picture. And it was lucky that he got this picture because this is the only one that was taken of this incident. He got the picture just as Konrad Schumann was jumping. And the reason he was able to do it was he had background in taking pictures of horses that jump, horses at competition that jump over railings or whatever. So anyway, we have this great picture of escape in Germany. But very quickly, the East Germans realized that the way the border was set up, it wasn't going to work. It was still very easy to cross. There were people swimming the channels in Berlin to get across, people jumping over the border. So they started to move towards building something more permanent. Sorry. And this is eventually what was developed. You have the main wall facing West Berlin. Then there's what's called the no man's land, and then the interior wall, or the interior fence in East Berlin. And there would be guard towers and dogs and things like that. I'll show you a better diagram in a minute. The thing I really like about this picture is is fast forward to today, and this is the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, and this is a road called Unter den Linden. And right here in this empty space is where the American embassy is today, which is on the former East German side. And in the back corner of this plaza is the French embassy, and then down the road is the Russian. So if you ever get a chance, there are some people, because last year was the 20th anniversary of the fall of the wall, there are some great pictures out there where someone took a picture during the Cold War of a particular place, and then someone has since gone back and taken pictures of those same spots. And it's interesting to see the change. But at the time, this is the sturdy wall that went up and lasted for about almost 30 years. There was still, as the border got tighter, as they started putting in a firm wall, and actually they instituted a shoot-to-kill policy for those who tried to escape from the east. The guards were free to kill them, and actually the guards got bonuses and promotions if they managed to kill East Germans trying to escape. This is a famous picture of Peter Fechter, who was an 18-year-old bricklayer in East Germany, and he and his friend decided that they were going to make a break for the wall. His friend managed to get over the wall while they were being shot at, and Peter Fechter was shot in the pelvis. It went through his femoral artery. So it was a critical, probably a mortal wound. But what ended up happening was both sides were so afraid, both the guards and the soldiers in the west and the guards in the east, of confrontation, that neither helped him. So he ended up, it took about an hour, but he bled to death at the wall. And then eventually the East Germans came out and took the body away. But it became a very strong international symbol for what the wall meant and sort of the evil of the division of Berlin. In total, about 1,200 people had died from the 60s to the late 1980s, crossing the borders. Now that's not just the border in Berlin, that's not just the Berlin Wall, but that includes the heavily fortified border between East and West Germany. So again, we talk about how the wall usually is evil for one side, or one side builds it for protection, the other side sees it as evil or reducing freedom. This wall was seen as evil for both sides. Oh, and this is just the border. We saw a little bit of this already, but this is just a diagram of how some of the areas were constructed. There's an outer wall, there's an inner wall, there are dogs, there's actually a sand bed so that you can see footprints as people walk across the bed, and they'd be able to see it from the tower. There are anti-car trenches and anti-tank things, because this was the Cold War. There was fear that if war would break out, that the Allies would try to come across. And also the anti-car, there were a few people who, initially when the wall was very weak, it was just barbed wire, they would drive through. And there were quite a few incidents of that. But basically what happened was every time somebody tried something new, something innovative, they found a way to block that. And then you had to continue to find a different way to get across the wall. Now in 1963, President Kennedy comes, this is only 2 years after the wall went up. President Kennedy comes to Berlin and gives the famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech. This is President Kennedy with West Berlin Mayor Willy Brandt, and future president, and the current Chancellor Konrad Adenauer. You can see the wall and the soldiers, and then the Brandenburg Gate in the back. He basically gave the speech. It was kind of a dog and pony show to show the West's support for West Berlin. But really, from this point forward, it seemed like a permanent situation. Neither side, neither the Soviets nor the Americans, were going to take any chances and try to change the situation in Berlin, because there was such a fear of that ending in, you know, nuclear conflict between the two. So they weren't going to try to facilitate. The East wasn't, or I'm sorry, the Americans weren't going to try to facilitate any change in the situation in Berlin because of that fear. So you had sort of this sense of the wall became normal after that. And then actually in the 1970s, West Berlin finally recognized the existence of East Berlin as a country. So then even more, it served to reinforce the situation that Germany is divided. Then in 1987, we have the next big presidential speech in Berlin, and that's Ronald Reagan gave the Tear Down This Wall speech. At the time, the Cold War, it seemed like it was starting to thaw. Gorbachev was in charge in the Soviet Union. He was seen as potentially a reformer. So to sort of stoke reform, to stoke the fire, Reagan comes to Berlin and gives a speech and says, open the borders, tear down the wall, let there be free travel between the East and the West. But there was no indication that this would really work. You know, the wall wasn't going to come down the next day. It was still a speech, and as far as speeches can go in bringing action. But 2 years later, the wall did come down. On November 9th, 1989, was the day that's normally credited with the wall falling. Now again, everything didn't change overnight. It wasn't like people could freely move. But what actually happened was, stepping back 2 months, or 3 months, in August of 1989, Hungary opened its borders with Austria. And people in the East started flowing across to the West, and that included a lot of East Germans. The Germans tried to put a stop to that, a stop to the East Germans leaving, and then Czechoslovakia opened their borders and people went across that border. And then shortly after that, there were protests, peaceful protests in East Germany. It's called the Peaceful Revolution, protesting, saying we want access to the West, we want to be able to leave and to travel. So the East German Politburo actually did decide at a meeting that they would open the wall. They would open the wall on November 17th. Now the spokesperson for the Politburo went out and did a press conference, you know, like the president would do, or Gibbs would do, the press secretary. And he was handed a little note saying that this was going to be the policy. But apparently they didn't convey the idea that the borders weren't opening until November 17th. So a reporter asked him, when would this take effect? And he said, immediately, without delay. That news went out into the West and into the East, across the radio and across radio. And so East Germaners started to gather at the border because they wanted to be able to cross and see people they knew on the West. Now at first there was a sort of brief standoff. The guards were caught off guard, the border guards. As I said, they were trained to shoot to kill those who tried to go across the border. And it looked like initially like a potentially dangerous situation, but they avoided a Tiananmen Square or something like that, or Hungary in the 50s, a violent incident, and eventually the soldiers backed down and let people cross. So that's the night that you have the iconic images of people standing on the wall from the East and people taking chips off of the wall as souvenirs and things like that. But again, the wall didn't come down overnight. Really what it meant was they were going to open up more border crossings. So when you see pictures of like a crane taking away a piece of the wall, again, that's not the wall falling away. That's them opening more border stations. But within a year, actually less than a year later, in October of '90, Germany had reunified. So they reunified very quickly, and obviously a wall was no longer necessary. The picture I want to end the Berlin section on, I think I really like this picture because this is actually a picture of the regular border between East and West Germany. And the sign essentially says that that is also Germany over there. And you see the East German border guards and the fence in the back and the tower. That's looking east. And that's really what happened. I mean, it was the division of a very culturally and ethnically homogenous country. They were all Germans, divided for 30 years because of political ideology. Yeah, so a lot of people had new people on the other side of the wall. They may have had family on the other side of the wall. I've read stories of, someone in the West dies and someone in the East wants to travel to the funeral, and it's very, very difficult. It would be very difficult. So a lot of people didn't get to see their relatives for 30 years. Yes. So both people on both sides of the wall, again, saw the wall as evil, but it was put up as a policy response to a problem that the East Germans thought they had, or that they did have, in the flight of their people. Now, another wall that still exists today, that people are still dealing with today, is the wall in Israel, between Israel and Palestine. Now, this is one where I'm not even going to attempt to give you the history of this conflict, because really the conflict in the Middle East goes back through all of history, including biblical history. I mean, I guess they say that David conquered Jerusalem in about 1000 BC, and then you had constant turnover and conquering and reconquering, including the Romans during the time of Christ. And then you had the Muslims conquered the area in 600 AD, and then you had the Crusades, where the Christians came and were going to take back Jerusalem and the Holy Land, and the Crusaders then left in 1291. The Ottomans came in and took over Palestine in 1517, and then their empire fell apart after they lost in World War I. And then eventually the British gained control of Palestine. It was called the British Mandate. And that's really where we're going to start, is with the creation of Israel, is more of the modern history. And even as we talk about that, we're going to skip a lot, because so much has happened in this area. But yeah. In 1948, you have the establishment of Israel. Now, in 1947, there was a plan to establish a Jewish country in the Middle East. It was after the Holocaust, the horrors of the Holocaust. The world sort of wanted to give Jews a place to call home. And there was this idea of taking the area of Palestine and splitting it roughly in half. The Jews would kind of get the center section of Palestine, and then the Palestinian Arabs would get what became Gaza and the West Bank, and then a little bit at the top, and theirs would be sort of divided. But roughly the landmass was about the same. What ended up happening was this plan didn't peacefully come about. So Israelis declared their independence. There was a war of independence between them and the Arab Palestinians and Arab neighbors. The Israelis won, and they ended up taking much more land than was originally designed in the mandate. But at the end of that war, you had Israel, yeah. And you had Egypt was controlling what's now the Gaza Strip, and you have Jordan controlling what's now the West Bank. And then we flip forward a few years. Again, there's a lot that happened in between, but these are the big things, to the SixDay War in 1967. And this was a time of high tension between Israel and the neighbors. The neighbors always, and still today, don't believe that Israel has a right to be there. Fearing war with Egypt, Israel preemptively invades the Sinai Peninsula in just a few days, defeats the Egyptians because of agreements. Jordan attacks Israel from the west, so Israel invades the West Bank, and Syria attacks Israel from the north in the Golan Heights, so Israel invades the Golan Heights. And Israel wins, and you can see that basically the landmass more than doubles. And they are now in control of Sinai, West Bank, Golan Heights, and Gaza. Now, Israel makes peace with Egypt, so Sinai goes back to Egypt, but it's demilitarized. They're not allowed to have any Egyptian military in the peninsula. And now you have, if not, you might not be able to call them friendly relations between the country, but there's not the threat of war. But Israel maintains control over Gaza, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. Until 1993, you have the Oslo Accords, where the Palestinian National Authority is created. It's created to be a temporary government for Palestine, and it's meant to be someone that the Israelis could negotiate with to try to negotiate an end to the situation. And also you have the agreement by Israel to leave the Gaza and the West Bank by 1996, which they do. So they leave, they cede more control of the territory, West Bank and Gaza, to the Palestinian Authority. But the situation has since we can't say fall apart, but it's since gotten worse, or there's increased violence. We have now what's called the Second Intifada, which is just a period of increased violence between the two sides. Getting ahead of myself. And that began in 2000. Both sides have perpetrated violence against each other. We saw this clearly. It was, I think it was last year with the short war between Gaza and and Israel. As a form of protection, Israel has built a wall, has basically walled off the Gaza Strip. Now there's also strong borders around the West Bank, but it's not to the extent of basically walling the entire thing off. And actually it's not just Israel, it's also Egypt. Egypt had walled off its section to prevent the movement of guns and things like that to Hamas in Gaza. So it was originally, again, created as to deal with a short-term security issue. But the wall, what it was really done is created sort of a pressure cooker system within Gaza, in that there's also a blockade of, by Israel of Gaza, of economic activity in Gaza. So it's very difficult to get goods in and out, to have free trade with Gaza. So the situation is pretty poor in the Gaza Strip. And then you had Hamas taking over the Gaza Strip in I believe it was 2006 or 2007. And things have just continued to deteriorate. And additionally, Gaza has found ways to still attack Israel even with the existence of the wall. Now, instead of, human bombs or whatever, they lob rockets over the wall into Israel, and that was the impetus for the war that we saw last year between the two. This all came to a head in January of 2008 when the Palestinians actually broke through the wall on the Egyptian border. It started with Hamas blowing a hole in the wall and then knocking part of it down. And they estimate that about 1.3 million Gazans crossed the border just for the purpose of buying food, buying goods that they needed from the Egyptians. The Egyptians resealed the border within 11 days, so it's not, they weren't happy about the breach in the wall. But again, Hamas and others have found ways to get around the situation. They tunnel underneath the wall, which was something common in Berlin as well, at least for escapes. Hamas does it to get in weapons and food and things like that for the people. But this is the situation sort of as it stands today. Now, there are interesting ties between the two. Because the Berlin Wall is so iconic, and it stood, and it was evil, and then it was, and then it fell, and the people were reunited. There's a lot of imagery and a lot of symbolism that comes along with that. So I found these pictures interesting. Another common thing that they share is graffiti. The west side of the Berlin Wall was very graffitied by 1989. And that happens as well in Gaza. If you can read this, it says, "My president, tear down this wall." So the reference to the Reagan speech in Berlin in 1987. On another section, "Ich bin ein Berliner," reference to the Kennedy speech in 1963. And this one I think is particularly funny, even though it's a difficult situation. But in my previous life, I was the Berlin Wall. The beer was better there. But so they're, because they have this other symbolic wall that means so much, they're able to draw connections between the two and say that, we want this wall to come down as well because our freedom is being restricted. It's such a poor situation within Gaza and such. So I want to end the Israel-Palestine section on another funny cartoon, but I think it's thought-provoking as well. And that's, oh, I'm sorry. I always forget this slide. Sorry, this is backing up a moment to the tie between the Berlin Wall and Gaza. This is actually a section of the Berlin Wall, and this is in Berlin today. It's a place called the East Side Gallery in Berlin. It's the only standing continuous section of wall that still exists. And what they did in 1990, 1991 was allow artists to come in, paint sort of iconic images on it of freedom and also walls and separation and things like that. So this is one of the paintings. It's the German flag, the Palestinian flag, and then the Israeli flag layered over top, and who stopped the war. I think it's supposed to say who will stop the war. But anyway, drawing a connection between the two in Berlin itself and lending to that imagery. But anyway, so the image that I'd like to end on is the question of what would happen if the Palestinian wall had been up in the time of Christ. You would have had the wise men would have had to dig under the wall to get to Bethlehem. So really what's being walled off are areas that are very important to quite a few people, not just the people that live there. Obviously the situation is particularly important for people who live there, but also Christians and Muslims and Jews abroad. It's a very important area to all of their religions, and right now it's divided and it's dangerous. So wrapping up Palestine, the walls around the Palestinian territories again were created a short-term policy response to protect Israel from attacks from Hamas in Gaza and attacks from the West Bank. And it worked in the short term, but in the long run, Hamas found a way to still attack Israel in spite of the wall. They're able to tunnel out to bring weapons in. The wall hasn't been incredibly effective, and what it's really done is it's created a permanent division in that situation. It's created a permanent divide, or what looks like a physically permanent divide a physical barrier in the division between Muslims and Jews in the Middle East. So it goes to reinforce that division. Now these walls don't just exist in other places. I wanted to talk about the walls in Ireland, but there's just too much to go over. There are walls in other places that separate people from each other, like people from each other. It also happens here in the U.S. We have the wall that's currently being constructed along the U.S.-Mexico border. And this is, again, a policy response to the threat of the perceived threat of illegal immigration. And it has especially it's been tied also to national security after 9/11 and the fear of terrorists coming across the border. Has also lent power to the idea of building a wall. Excuse me. The GAO, the Government Accountability Office, calculates that about 500,000 illegals have come across the border each year since 1992. That's sort of an average. It's usually between 400,000 and 700,000, depending on the year. But it is quite a situation that has to be dealt with. The question is whether a wall is the most effective policy option. In 2006, the U.S. passed the Secure Fence Act, which allows for the building of about 700 miles of double reinforced wall. Now, when I saw that, I thought, well, what does that mean? What is double reinforced wall? Well, actually, when I found a picture of it, the interesting thing is, again, it looks a lot like the situation in Berlin, where the double reinforced wall is the wall on the border, which they curve out to make it difficult to climb over. And then there's the sandy road in between that the border guards can go back and forth across in their trucks. And then there's the wall, the interior wall. The goal being trying to catch people either before they get over or somewhere in between. There's money in the bill for guard towers, for aerial surveillance, for alarms on the border and things like that. A lot of the things other than the aerial surveillance that were used in Germany, in East Berlin, or in Berlin. Thankfully, the only policy that hasn't carried over is the shoot-to-kill policy. We don't do that with folks trying to come over the border. But other than that, it's very much, the situation is very similar to that or has similarities to that in Germany. Now, what's really happened, again, as we talk about whether this is effective, is as the wall extends, it hasn't necessarily kept people from coming in. They just walk farther to get around the wall. And what it's effectively doing is it's making people walk out into more desolate and deserted parts of the border. You see here the border wall along a desert part of the border, maybe Arizona and Mexico or western Texas, I'm not sure. And what that's doing is it has caused an increase in the number of deaths of those trying to come across the wall. Again, from the same GAO report in the 90s, it started at maybe 100 died a year trying to get across, and it's gone up to 400, 500, 600. And I'm sure it's increased since then as they've been reinforcing and extending the wall. So people are still trying to get across. They still want freedom and they still want opportunity, and that's what they're trying to find. But we're just, really what we're doing is we're just making it more difficult for them to do it. But they're still going to find ways to do it, much like they did in Berlin. I'm sorry, and again, the consequences are the deaths have been increasing from year to year for those who try to cross. And then sort of the last image from this, I thought this one was very interesting, and again has a lot of ties back to Berlin. This is the city of Nogales, and it's a city that used to cross the border. And there's Nogales, Arizona, and this is America because you can see the border control agents, the ICE cars, Homeland Security, and Nogales, Mexico. And you can tell that this used to be sort of one continuous city. You can actually, it's a little harder to see because it's kind of far back there, but there's a road that's been cut across, it's been cut because of the wall. And you saw a great deal of that, of course, in Berlin. And it just goes to reinforce the idea that, and the connection between these two. So what has happened is, as a response to this policy problem, the fear of illegal immigration and people stealing jobs and terrorism and all these different fears, we've constructed a wall between us and our friendly neighbor to the south. We have friendly relations with Mexico. We have signed a free trade agreement with them to try to increase economic activity between the two, but yet at the same time, we've started to wall them off. And again, you can debate whether that's the most effective policy option, or there are others, but I can guarantee right now this is going to be a big discussion in the coming year or so as Congress considers, they're talking about passing another immigration bill. I'm sure the wall will be discussed because of the drug violence, the increased drug violence we've seen in Mexico, the thousands of assassinations that have been happening in Mexico, and there's fear of that violence spreading across the border. So I'm sure that this is something that will be, this is a policy option that will definitely be considered. But one thing to consider is the image that it creates to our friendly neighbor in the south, Mexico has protested the wall. Some of the border mayors have protested the wall. It's created environmental issues with cutting off habitats in the middle of the states and things like that. But I mean, it is a legitimate and a real response. Again, something to consider. And finally, not all walls are physical. Some are walls that we create between ourselves and our neighbors, or more maybe metaphorical, but are nonetheless, they're still reinforced legally. In the U.S., you had segregation has been a big part of our history. First slavery, and then segregation, and the fight for civil rights has just gone through, has been a thread through the entire history of the country. But it wasn't until it was 1896 that you had the idea of separate but equal was sort of established. And it was established by the Supreme Court in a decision called Plessy versus Ferguson, where the court ruled that Louisiana had separate accommodations for blacks and whites on, I think it was trains. It was originally a case about trains. I'd have to check that. But anyway, they had separate accommodations, and the court ruled that separate was okay as a policy option for Louisiana as long as the facilities on either side were equal. So as long as the bathrooms, say the bathrooms for whites and the bathrooms for blacks were about the same, it was fine. This carried over into sort of all parts of life, including education. As long as you could prove that the education was okay at a white school and a black school, that was acceptable to the Supreme Court. And this held for, well, this served to create walls between people within their own communities. Now, they didn't necessarily were neighbor to neighbor. A lot of people still clustered in their own sort of ethnic communities. But they all lived in the same cities, the same towns, and this served to create pretty lasting division between people. This stood for about 50 years until 1954. You had the Supreme Court reversed its decision, reversed its idea, and said that separate is not equal. And this was the case of Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, a major landmark case in U.S. history. And this was actually a case about education, focusing specifically on education. But the court decided that specifically in terms of education, they declared that separate educational facilities are inherently equal. Even if you can prove that the facilities itself provide the same education, just the separation itself is inherently unequal. And the reality was, a lot of times, these facilities were not equal. The white facilities were better than the black facilities. So it wasn't working, clearly. The interesting thing is that Plessy versus Ferguson was used as the precedent for the district court case when it went to the first federal level. The court said, Plessy versus Ferguson, separate is equal, case dismissed. It eventually appealed its way to the Supreme Court, took it up, and they actually reversed themselves, the long-standing precedent, and set a new one, that separate is inherently unequal. But again, integration didn't happen overnight, much like the Berlin situation didn't change overnight. There was a lot of protest to this. You had National Guard troops being called to escort students into newly integrated schools and things like that. You had backlash from Southern governors and such. But over time, eventually things were integrated and the situation started to change. But the fight for civil rights continued after Brown. And it continued through marches. Oops. Past that one. Through marches, a march with Dr. King, through protests, the famous picture of Rosa Parks, through speeches, the I Have a Dream speech in Washington, and also through tragedy, through 2 assassinations in 1968 of both Dr. King and Senator Kennedy. So it was a very difficult process going from, the decision happened that separate is not equal and that cannot be used as a policy basis. But it took many more years, and you can argue that it's still an issue that the country, of course, is dealing with today. And Dr. King was the one at the time who really, the one, who this week is focused on, who worked to try to bring down these barriers of segregation, racial segregation in the country. And his legacy has carried on into other parts of our society, other places where people have said, wow, there's separation here for a particular inherent trait. How can we remove that? And it's carried on into the feminist movement and the women's rights after civil rights, the fight, basically protest here in the fight against apartheid in South Africa. And then you see it today in the gay rights debate in the United States. And a lot of these groups have used some of the tactics and the rhetoric and things from the civil rights process to try to take down what they see as walls that continue to exist in society. So after all that, after physical walls and a little bit of history and some of our own history, the wrap-up question, of course, is what is, to me, the message of 1989, and how does the Berlin Wall tie into this? And I tie these all together. Berlin it's provided humanity with that powerful symbol that we talked about of both division and freedom. It was an evil wall that existed, and then it was overcome, and Germany was reunited. It's probably still the most recognizable wall image in recent history, but it's not the only one, as we've talked about with the Gaza Wall, the situation in cities in Northern Ireland, the wall in the United States, and also the walls that we put between each other. Governments continue to use walls as instruments of policy, and they seek to divide people who have what they consider to be irreconcilable differences. Walls certainly have their place. It's a valid policy idea, as we talked about with the wall along the Mexico border. But when making that decision, they protect us from the dangers of the world, but when making that decision, you have to remember that there are 2 sides to every wall. And in the end, people on both sides, at the most basic level, are, whether they're Germans and Germans, or they're the average Palestinian and the average Israeli, or the Mexican looking for opportunity and the American farmer, or the American labor worker. They're all just sort of trying to survive and all trying to provide for their families. So when considering a wall as an act of policy like U.S.-Mexico, it's important just to take a moment and think about those things. Think about the policy consequences down the road. And also think about whether that wall is effective. The typical cost-benefit analysis is the cost of us putting up this wall that may be perceived as evil or wrong, or do the benefits outweigh that potential cost. The other part of the message, which I think is more abstract, and it's just kind of a message to end the day, is that we tend to build walls for our own protection in our daily lives. And it's usually between ourselves and someone that we don't understand well or don't like. One example might be a coworker that you don't get along with, or a roommate freshman year that you were stuck with, and you just didn't think you guys had anything in common and couldn't get along. But the message, I guess the other part of the message is to reevaluate the walls that we're building in our own lives and what effect they have on the happiness and success of both ourselves and those around us. And think back to Palestine and Berlin and the idea that walls tend to not actually solve problems. They just put them off for another day and tend to make them worse. So when you go back to classes today, just try to think about the walls that you may have built between yourselves and others. And instead of building walls, it might be a good time to reach out and try to understand those on the other side, because that's the only way towards real progress. And I think that's the message of 1989, is that these walls that people put up between themselves don't actually lead to real progress to solving problems. They tend to just punt it off into the future and potentially make it worse. So the only way to move forward is to sort of try to take down those barriers and try to understand each other, is I think the broader message. So I guess that's the end of my presentation. I'd entertain any questions or comments or thoughts if anybody has anything. But no? All right. Well, thank you. It's just meant to be a thought piece for today, and thinking about the legacy of Dr. King and the work that he did to tear down walls in our own society. So thank you for coming. Enjoy the rest of your classes, or if you're going to more Freedom Day presentations or that. Thank you.